we're hearing like boom, bang, crash, down the side of the mountain of all this metal stuff, car parts. And I'm just like, oh, I remember who I am. I remember where I've come from. I remember where I'm going. So none of this matters. And I'm just getting shivers even saying that now. I was wide awake, more wide awake than I've ever been in my life. It was 2017 in August, and I was the passenger in a car. My ex-partner was driving the car, and we were driving along a mountain road. So the mountain was kind of like this, and the road was wrapping itself around the mountain. And so if you look out one window, the mountain went right straight up. And if you look out the other window, there's like a cement guardrail here and then a straight drop. So it was kind of waving around like that. And it was pretty skinny road too. So if you needed to kind of swerve out of the way to miss something, there was no room. And an oncoming car lost control and came into our lane. So he was headed straight on for our car. And so my partner tried to swerve out of the way towards this side, like over there. But there was only a really skinny gravel shoulder. So we did avoid the oncoming car, but because we were going really pretty quick to be on a gravel shoulder, the car lost control and started to spin. When the car spun and kind of came back onto the road and was totally out of control, our car hit the next car that was coming. So we got into their lane and there was a collision. And then our car flipped upside down and landed wheels up on the concrete guardrail. So half of the car was kind of like hanging over the guardrail, over the edge, and the other half was still on the roadside. Just kind of like this. When we opened our eyes, all we could see were, like upside down trees going straight down. So those were the facts of what happened that day. But what happened for me was totally different. One other thing that's kind of important and I believe had something to do with slipping out of my body was I'd been working as a paramedic for a long time, not too far from that area. And we used to always make jokes that the paramedics that would work in that stretch of highway had very little experience because all the cars would just go over the edge when there was an accident. So I guess I just had that in my awareness that if you collide on this road, you die. It's very few survivors. So as soon as the car lost control and we headed towards the gravel shoulder, I closed my eyes, 100% believing that I was about to die. And I just remember trying to relax into my seat, trying to relax my muscles, and just kind of like when a plane is taking off, like, okay, time, this is my moment. And so this all happened really, really fast. And so as soon as I closed my eyes, that's when everything changed. As soon as I relaxed, time for me totally slowed down. And the first thing that I remember happening was not hearing anything, not having any senses, not seeing. And this huge lightness that I've never yet and haven't since experienced. And when I say a lightness, like, it's not just like, okay, we're used to kind of carrying around this heavy body and I slipped out of it, but also this lack of mind chatter, lack of tension, lack of anxiety, lack of looking around. These things that we do all day, every day, it was suddenly not available to me. And I was in this really light space. I was wide awake, more wide awake than I've ever been in my life. And looking back, the best way that I can kind of compare this realness to realness that people talk about is if you think about times where you've had, too many drinks of alcohol and you're maybe a little dehydrated and a bit tired, things aren't super clear. you're kind of partially there. But then when you wake up in the morning and drink a cup of coffee, a glass of water, you're kind of back. It's a little bit more real than that night before. So where this out of the body spot that I suddenly popped into had this extra crisp, clear, authentic realness. It was dark, but it wasn't dark as far as it was frightening. It was dark in a way that I would describe as like cave-like, soft, almost like with a feathery, feminine, in like womb-like safety. That's the first thing that I realized. And I wasn't thinking about Earth. I wasn't thinking about the car accident. It really wasn't in my awareness because I was suddenly here. And then after I kind of had adjusted my awareness to being in this black, soft, beautiful space, the next thing that I was aware of was what I call the presence. And it was like not being alone in that space. So even though I couldn't see any other beings, I couldn't see any other people, I was, seemingly alone. It was as though I was completely surrounded with this all-knowing, ultra-intelligent presence. And it wasn't foreign to me. It was like presence that I'd known for so long that my awareness couldn't even go back far enough to know, how many eons I knew this presence. There's nothing in the universe that I knew better than this presence upon arriving and kind of like reconnecting there suddenly. And it knew me. And so without words, I was kind of communicating with this presence. And the best way for me to kind of describe the quality in that moment, that long outside of time moment, was if you think of like a lovely old grandfather you've gone to visit and you haven't seen in a really long time. And he's kind of like, sitting there in the corner smiling with his cup of tea. He wants to hear everything. Where have you been kind of thing? And tell me all the stories. Tell me about all your adventures, and just wants to hang on your every word because you've been off on your travels. And that's kind of like a small sliver of the quality of this presence. Like someone was really excited to see me. And when I say someone, it was more than like one being. It almost had the quality of like a surrounding choir. Like I could kind of, if I just thinking back, I could kind of like take my awareness and like move it to the right and the left. And it was like there was many, but they were all in the same vibe, all completely connected. And when I was there with them or it or that full on presence, I was also of the same wavelengths, as them. I was no different. I wasn't some little, girl that had been on Earth. And no, like my real self was with them. And so time I wasn't aware of time. I just kind of hovered there. And there was some kind of a reconnection with this beyond ancient family that I call God, that I call it a representation of the divine. And suddenly I realized who I really was for the first time ever. This is who I really was. And I'd been having an experience as a 35-year-old Canadian girl and collecting, experience. And so the relaxation and the awareness of that just brought this kind of like this cosmic smile to me up there. And I don't know how long I was there. To be honest, that's the part that I remember and that I hold on to as kind of like my North Star now. But I know that there was more that I haven't yet remembered. And the reason I know that is that this was 5 years ago. So in some meditations, in some plant medicine ceremonies, I have kind of stepped outside of time and revisited part of what happened up there and been like, oh, now I remember we discussed this. You reminded me of this. And I'm just getting shivers even saying that now. So I know that there was more, and I haven't uncovered like probably the tip of the iceberg. Anyway, the next thing I knew was my hearing started to come back and I was upside down. I was just suddenly back without warning. And at first it was like muffled sounds, people yelling. I heard people say, I don't want to look at a dead body, So nobody really is really approaching the car, but I started to be able to hear bystanders. Someone came and let us out of the car, and my ex-partner, like, he was screaming. He was very, very upset. But I was in a complete state of bliss, like a complete state of bliss wherever I was. And that wavelength that I was on with the presence was more real and more with me than any of these bystanders, than a crushed car, or that anything. And, you could still hear, like, we had gone camping. So our trunk was like full of like metal pots and like camping equipment. And, we're hearing like boom, bang, crash, down the side of the mountain of all this metal stuff, car parts. And I'm just like, oh, I've just been home. I remember who I am. I remember where I've come from. I remember where I'm going. So none of this matters. It's really not a big deal. So I wasn't hurt at all. I had a little bit of whiplash on my shoulder, which is pretty incredible considering like the condition of the car. So I climbed out once someone let me out, and I sat on the concrete guardrail, and I just was staring off into the trees, thinking about how beautiful it is. And so, ambulance and like fire trucks and all these first responders are coming and rushing us into an ambulance. And my partner is still like totally freaking out. And everything's a big mess. And, we went to the hospital and that kind of thing. So that's what happened.
Amanda, thank you so much for sharing. And I just have so many things that I want to talk to you about. Some of the things that you mentioned are also things that I experienced in my out-of-body experience that I had as a teenager. And I've never heard anybody else mention these things before. So I'm excited about it. But the first thing you said was that you would describe the presence to a grandfather. And I don't talk about this very often because I feel like when I do, people don't get it. But that was my experience too. It was that this presence is so far beyond offense that there is nothing that can upset him, her, it, nothing that can make it mad, nothing that can sever this like complete adoration that it has for us. And it reminded me more of a grandfather than a parent in that sense, because there's no like discipline or harshness to it.
Oh, it's totally. There's only curiosity and love.
And then another thing you said, the feeling that it was a being, but also beings. And I have that too, because I look back on it and I'm like, it was a presence, but then all of a sudden, all of my, what I call my angels and guides were there. And when did they arrive? It's like it was happening outside of time. So there was no when they arrived, but was there many of them or was there just one? It's hard to tell sometimes.
Yes, that's a really good way of putting it. It's like the feeling of being with one, but there's like an awareness of many qualities or many identities in that one.
Totally. And then another question I wanted to ask you, you mentioned a couple times that you remembered who you really were. Is it possible to describe that a little bit? Like, who are we really? And what was your experience of that?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I remember qualities. So not like identities or egos or personalities or genders or any of those things. I just remember qualities that were like living, that were alive. And the qualities that I re-experienced, personally were first innocence, like, like a teenager that's gone out on an exploration, that's gone out on a hike with, like not too much, but a small compass, who wants to see the world, the innocence of an explorer who who wants to experience different realities, that wants to see if itself can be remembered in a very forgetful, dense place, and knowing without remembering that there will be a return. So it kind of doesn't matter exactly what happens. Either way, it's going to be okay. So there was the innocence of that kind of thing. And then besides the innocence, it was just like a full acceptance, like a full, I hesitate to say self, because there's not really like a self when you reconnect up there. But this quality of acceptance that no matter what shows up, no matter what's been done or what mistake, which I don't think there really are any, has been made, it's basically like information. It's like information to be curious about. It could be, when I say remember who we are, I felt that who I really was when I revisited there was awareness. But, you know, when a lot of people, especially in Eastern teachings, talk about us being just awareness, it kind of sounds cold. You know, there's kind of like I don't know what the word is, just kind of a seriousness to it. But that's not all. There's so much more than that. So I remembered that I was pure awareness, but was quite in touch with qualities of curiosity and innocence and exploration as being part of awareness. And that those were, I'm sure there are I know that there are kind of levels of re-merging with the divine that were beyond where I was. But the level at where I got to visit was exploring and experiencing those perfect, I shouldn't even say perfect, it's like unique, perfectly unique qualities of myself before I got any farther.
Oh, that's fascinating to me, because innocence is also the primary state of being that I remember also. Thank you for explaining that so beautifully. You mentioned that you remembered some of your conversations in meditations and plant ceremonies. Did you forget all of that when you came back, or do you still remember some of that?
So the first thing that I remembered, when I came back, I just remembered what I just told you now about kind of being in that dark space and coming back. In a plant medicine ceremony in, I think it was 2019, I visited a place that was a golden glowing dome. It was cave-like, but the walls of the cave were kind of glowing a golden color. And there was language on the walls of that dome that I didn't understand, or I couldn't read. It looked slightly Egyptian or something quite ancient. So I suddenly found myself in this dome, and there was a real sacredness, a real silence. Nobody was talking. And there was 2 or 3 people kind of sitting and praying or meditating. They were just sitting. I didn't even focus in on them too much, but their presence was there. And then there was a medicine man, a Caucasian medicine man. And I recognized him as the shaman that was actually running the ceremony that night. But he looked quite different. He looked quite ancient, but he had the same features on his face. And so he just looked at me, and he looked through me. Again, I'm getting chills just remembering this. And he slowly smiled. And then he said to me, "You're not going to remember this right away, but you survived. You will survive this accident for a reason. You have other things to do during this lifetime, and it's going to be very difficult for accident. Therefore, we are going to send to you a sacred medicine that you don't really know much about right now, but it will find you. You don't need to go looking for it. And you won't remember this conversation. And this medicine is going to help you remember what you need to know and integrate for the rest of this life. It'll be there to guide you." I believed him. It was like he was not just speaking truth, he was glowing truth at me telepathically. And again, this cave where I I found myself in the ceremony with him was also quite a bit outside of time. I have the sense that I spent some time there just kind of taking in the atmosphere of that cave, because that was actually just as important as the words that he was speaking to me. I was going to need that calmness of that atmosphere to bring back with me when I finished with the car accident.
Wow. So you saw your shaman in your near-death experience, but you just didn't remember it until later?
It wasn't even my shaman. When I was kind of doing a lot of the ayahuasca ceremonies, it was up in Canada with a woman. And this was after about a year of kind of being in and out of that. And I happened to be in Costa Rica. And so the center that I was visiting for the ceremony was in Costa Rica, and I didn't know anyone there. I just kind of went last minute. I did a bit of research, but then I was like, okay, I'm going. I never even had a chance to talk to him about it. I just kind of kept it to myself. So he has no idea.
That's fascinating. I often wonder how all of those things work. In another retelling of your experience that I heard you give, you said that when you came back, you felt blissed out. And I'm wondering, how long did that last? And do you think that's a state that we can maintain here?
That is a fabulous question. So what happened for me, I had the whiplash. So I took some time off my paramedic job. I took about 4 months off to make sure I could, go back and lift people. And during that time, I was literally just like sitting on my couch, and I felt like I was just floating through the air. Like I knew that I wasn't, but I had the sensation of when a plane takes off or when you're riding on a horse really fast, that feeling in the body. But I was just sitting on my couch. And so there wasn't much that I wanted to do because it would interrupt that. But for about 6 months, I was kind of in a meditative state, like I just kind of did my thing, but I didn't do much. After the 6 months, I started making some pretty radical changes in my life. I left my partner and I sold my house. And soon after that, I quit my job as a paramedic and I lived in my camper van. And during all of those changes, I was still more or less in this state of being. And I would like to also add that when him and I split up, it was sometime I guess it was maybe 8 months after, 9 months. It was actually a really traumatic experience. He had, from the accident, a concussion, and the whole accident plus the concussion brought up a lot of his old trauma, and he was acting very violent towards me. That's the reason for this sudden split. However, even, on the receiving end of that violence before I left, it was like, it was happening, but I was more like an observer, and I was just kind of like, okay, this is what I'm going to do because this is happening. Okay, this is what I should do next. It wasn't like, oh my God, like, poor me or screw him. There was none of that. It was like, I was just kind of like following the way. So then I got myself into the camper van and put most of my stuff in storage. And I was almost 2 years living in a pretty sweet RV with my 2 big dogs and traveling around Western Canada at just different lakes, going camping, visiting people I hadn't seen in a long time, doing art, making music. And I had the money from the car accident. Like I had some money from a settlement that we received. So I really didn't even have to work. So I was completely in nature, was completely immersed in nature and going to some ayahuasca ceremonies throughout that time. And then I would say, about 2 years of this blissful state. Around the time that the pandemic started, I was in the van and I had become quite sensitive to energy at that point with all the, smack of my nervous system. And when the pandemic started, I started to feel very strange in my body. I myself wasn't really worried about getting a virus and I wasn't worried about work or money, but I could feel this heaviness and this denseness kind of descend on me that I'd never really experienced before. And then on top of that, I was used to using like my friends' houses, the pools, the gyms, like to shower, do laundry, once in a while, and everything was suddenly closed. And even friends didn't want me to come by because they didn't know if I might be sick. And so in Canada, it was like kind of cold and drizzly. And I was suddenly like the opposite. I was the opposite of bliss. I was like back. And that started for me an extremely deep, dark night of the soul and a massive physical purging and kind of like a kundalini, I don't know what you want to call it, kundalini energy in the body that was hitting a lot of blocks that were not getting hit during the bliss period. And that started what I would say is my real spiritual journey.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. I've heard that progression so many times where people will experience some type of spiritual awakening where they experience bliss or a samadhi state. And then when it comes down, it's the dark night of the soul and they have to work through all of their trauma. Do you have any advice for somebody who might be going through that? I should probably give the qualification that I'm not a mental health professional and I don't know.
I'm not either.
So, but just based on your own experience.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. For myself, my dark night of the soul was different than what I would say chronic depression. So sometimes people don't really know, is this chronic depression? Am I in a dark night of the soul? There are some similarities for sure. I had an extremely chronic case of depression for almost 7 years in high school where I was just sleeping all day and all night and I had an eating disorder. So I do know what that is like. This dark night of the soul had some of those qualities, but it had a spiritual void, like disconnection quality as well, which almost made it for me worse because I had just been so very connected and I was very suddenly not. And it really felt like, did I even really have a near-death experience? Were any of those ayahuasca ceremonies real? Like maybe I was just making that up. Like I really started to actually doubt all of these beautiful things that had happened to me, all of these synchronicities, all these blessings with, money coming in. And I was like, oh, I'm just kind of like a magical thinker. And I was making all that up because I was so disconnected from my intuition. I was not getting any signs when I would pray and I was not having any synchronicities. And it was almost like everything was actually just going wrong. And then a lot of troubles that I had as a teenager when I was very much depressed and in the throes of an eating disorder started to also be experienced. So when I was a teenager, I had a lot of undiagnosed stomach pain. I was quite a sensitive, shy person. And the only thing that would take away the stomach pain was to eat. So I found myself at about age 14 starting to eat like every 2 hours and, quite a bit of food. And so, I didn't gain a ton of weight, but I was overweight and I was always full. Like I was always full and kind of lethargic and sleepy. And then after about an hour of eating, the pain would come back. And so I became very much addicted to food, especially carbs, anything that would, boost feel-good hormones. So all that came back to me in the dark night of the soul. And at that point, I had moved to Mexico because I was looking for a place that was less locked down for me to live. And I knew that Mexico was quite open to travelers still. So I sold my van. I sold everything in the storage locker. I literally had a backpack at this point. And my friend took my dogs permanently. So I'm in Mexico in this Airbnb with no air conditioning. And I'm in the throes of this eating disorder again. And even like it hurt to practice yoga. My stomach hurt that much. I couldn't even do yoga poses. It was so dark. Like I even kind of wondered if God was real and if maybe there was like some people that had made up the idea of God in order to trick us. Like I was actually getting quite paranoid as well. And so that's what happened. And it would come in waves. So I would start to feel a little bit better, not 100%, but like the stomach stuff would go away. My eating would kind of feel all right or whatever. But I still felt very alone in the universe. I would look at people smiling and laughing and playing on the beach. And I'd wonder what that might be like to feel connected. And I had, great friends, a counselor, like I had great people in my life, but I felt like they had no idea what I was experiencing. And so that was an experience of massive aloneness. So for people who are passing through that, it's important to know that, first of all, congratulations, because you've gotten to a point in your spiritual development without realizing it or not, that you're ready for the next step in your evolution, in starting to remember who you are. And in order for us to remember more of who we are and become more connected to the divine, there needs to be a purification, because our wavelength, our vibration as a human being, with all the blocks that we have and all the trauma and the resentments and the hate and all the things that we kind of carry around, those aren't a match for where we're going next. So we have to let those things go, and we get help by the energy of God being inside of us, whether we recognize it as that or not. And that energy of God, that quality of God's energy, starts to destroy what's in the way of our reconnection to the divine. So that's why a lot of people's old traumas seem to come up. And in the dark night of the soul, if you're in that, and I would, if I could speak to my former self, I would say, congratulations. And I would say, keep walking. Don't stop for too long. Stop to rest. Stop to take a breath. If you need to feel sorry for yourself for a few minutes, feel sorry for yourself for a few minutes. If you saw a child struggling and alone, you would have a little bit of pity. So that's fine. And then when you finish, take a breath and keep walking. Keep walking, because it's not going to last forever. And for me, it went on for a couple of years. And I didn't know if it was going to be 10 years. I didn't know if it was going to be how many years, because you start to get quite weary after it doesn't lift after a couple months. And yet you need to keep walking, and you need to keep believing that this is actually you being called home. This is an honor. It's an honor that you are receiving divine energy that's trying to blast through your blocks in order for you to come home.
That was so beautiful and really spoke to me as well. So thank you for sharing that. One other thing I wanted to ask you is that when you came back, and this is pretty typical for near-death experiencers to say something like this, but when you came back, you had this feeling that none of this, what's happening in this life, matters. And so I would love to hear your opinion on what is the purpose of this life, and is it important, or is it just something that we're doing for fun?
Yeah, great question. That's the thought that came in my mind when I was sitting on that concrete guardrail. Okay, well, none of this really matters. And to kind of expand on that, none of the chaos and the worry and all the things that were happening in the scene around me, none of that really in that moment, maybe it matters to someone temporarily, but in the scheme of things, it's literally the blink of an eye. And so in that moment, I saw it like that. I saw it like I was watching a movie, and I was like, oh, interesting. Everyone's freaking out. And I would say I was a little bit prepared for that because I was used to accident scenes from my job. And so I actually already didn't take things. If no one's dead and no one's in a critical condition, I always know everything's going to be fine anyway. So that did kind of help me, but it was I'm really right about this. It really doesn't matter. And then thinking about kind of life in general and what matters, that kind of thing. I believe it really matters as far as how it serves our soul's growth, how events serve unique, powerful experiences. It matters that way. But what really does matter are those experiences, are the things that we learn from them, the things that we enjoy about them, the things that even make us sad. Because, if I hurt someone or someone hurts me and sadness comes, what happened in the event of what was said or done doesn't matter. But what does matter is, wow, can I remember how that went down so that I don't do that again, and kind of collect that as a lesson and a memory? That's the part that does matter. But the actual events, who said what job was lost. It's all just part of a story. And it's like, arriving at the end of the story with more wisdom and more love is the real point.
Well, I love how you summed that up, arriving at the end of the story with more wisdom and love. Well, Amanda, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. And I would like to give you an opportunity to talk about what you do. I understand that you're a coach and you have a YouTube channel as well. So would you like to share more about that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm in my mentorship period of becoming a certified trauma coach, and my intention is to do spiritual coaching, but then have a trauma awareness, because sometimes when we're having spiritual things that we talk about, it can bring up trauma. So, but the focus will be spiritual issues. And I have a YouTube channel called Lion Spirit. And so I talk about things like death and shadow work and plant medicine and those kind of topics.
All right. And I will have those links in the description so people can check those out if they're interested. Is there any final word that you'd like to share with us before we go? Maybe something that sums up your experience?
Yeah. Even when things feel like they're really serious and really pressing and really intense, know that they're very, very temporary. Know that you can always take a step back and that you're just passing through. This is a special opportunity. It's a beautiful chance to be human and to feel the full spectrum, not just the bliss, but to feel even the difficult things, sit with them, and then let them pass through. Don't go through your whole life just avoiding and numbing out the hard things and focusing on the bliss, because it all contains what you came here for.
Thank you so much for that, Amanda. Thank you for watching the Love Covered Life podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, share this video with your friends, and comment with your thoughts and opinions. And check the description box for the links to my TikTok and Instagram, where I share the more personal side of my life, my website, where I share my paintings and merch, and also the Be a Guest link for anybody who's interested in sharing their story. Be loved, be happy, be at peace, and thank you for watching.